Hey guys, Sean here. Today, Luke and I are back with another tier list. Today we'll be ranking the best budget decks for January 2025. If you're broke like us, you'll love a good budget deck. There's a lot of really strong budget decks this format, so let's get right into the list. We have a few tiers here. We have
Salamangreat, great value, spending the Christmas money, Temu branded, and Purrely.
Let's get right into it. We have a really good fan favorite budget deck right here. We have Heroes. Let's preemptively say we do not know how expensive the evil hero cards are going to be from Supreme Darkness, and also we don't even know if Heroes are going to play them, but even if you ignore that, Heroes are a very good budget deck. The hero engine really hasn't changed in quite a while. I think the most recent support was like the favorite stuff, so like your favorite contact into your Shining Flare Wingman or whatever it is. All of those cards have been reprinted by this point and they're quite cheap. The whole engine is genuinely very cheap by Yu-Gi-Oh standards. The hero engine doesn't really run anything outside of itself, so it's just basically pure heroes. You don't need any other complementary engine, like your Fiendsmiths or anything like that. You can run this deck with the Primite cards, but that will cost you a lot more. But on its own, Pure Heroes is a very good budget deck. It can OTK very easily. You can set up really strong floodgates. You can set up a Dark Angel floodgate to lock your opponent out of spells. You can set up Plasma as a one-sided skill drain. You have Dark Law as a one-sided Macrocosmos, which is insanely strong. The deck can just do so many things. It's just a fantastic deck, especially for the price.
Definitely, the versatility of this deck is unmatched. Heroes are very good because not only can they build up a lot of floodgates so they can go first, much like what you said, but also there's some builds out there that kind of rely itself on going blind second, one that I've met on the channel as well. So there's a lot of different ways you can take this deck, so there's a lot of different budget options you can take. So I definitely recommend Heroes be high end of this list, definitely the second tier in spending the Christmas money.
Next up, Swordsoul. Swordsoul is also receiving some support with the new Tenyi stuff coming out in Supreme Darkness, which is going to be really good. I'm very excited to see how that goes. But again, not sure on the price of that, so that might be a bit of an issue. Right now, it's very budget. Protos was reprinted, so that's a great card that you can just play in this deck for really cheap. The most expensive card is pretty much your Moyi, but that's not even that expensive. It's basic, but it's strong. And of course, having the Protos lock available is just insanely good. It's just really good, especially for the price.
I definitely agree. Much like Heroes, the versatility is one of the main things you need to think about when picking up this deck. Not only can you play with the Tenyi stuff, but you can also play Swordsoul pure on its own. But even having said that, although we don't know the price of the Tenyi stuff that's coming out, we know the Tenyi stuff that's available right now is still fairly cheap. I think one of the main things to think about when it comes to Swordsoul is that this deck is very well balanced. So good thing about Swordsoul is that you are able to take games and it is a very balanced deck. Although you do have some floodgates with the likes of Protoss and stuff like that, the overall combos of Swordsoul, they're not too toxic, so they are quite fun to play and they can actually make for some interesting gameplay as well, kind of back and forth, unlike a few other decks in this list. So I definitely think Swordsoul is not only good in terms of budget, but it's also good in terms of how much fun you can have playing the deck as well. So I think it definitely deserves to be next to Heroes. I of course played Heroes a lot longer though. I do like Heroes quite a lot, so that's why we'd probably put Heroes just above them. But Swordsoul is still a deck not to be looked down upon.
Next up we have Sharks. Sharks are cool. Everyone loves a bit of Sharks. Sharks are a really good deck. They're really budget. They got new support in Rage of the Abyss, and that's a pretty big help for the deck. And of course that support is really cheap as well. It's really good at like turboing out cards like Totally Awesome, using cards like your Behemoth Shark, which is really cool. It makes really good use of cards like Stealth Kraken, which turns all your opponent's monsters to like water type, and you can like pop your opponent's water monsters, which is really cool. A lot of builds are using the Armored Exes package, which again, another really good package for the deck and very cheap. Sharks are a fan favorite and I can see why. The playstyle is really fun, has a lot of room for non-engine, which is really cool as well. I'm a big fan of it. I think it's pretty cool.
I agree, but I might put it just a little bit lower, maybe at the top of Temu branded. Just because I feel like since it's an Xyz deck, a lot of people are going to be packing cards to like try and crush Xyz because Raizio is kind of like the top tier right now, so you might be running into a lot of dimensional barrier and people will just be like calling out Xyz. Sharks are pretty cool, but they kind of just do the same thing that a lot of other decks that are topping a bit more than them are already doing. I mean that in the likes of the Goblin deck, which is pretty much going down the same route of Exes are able to throw in the Armored Exes package. And I think just the Goblins have a bit more consistency than the Sharks do. Although the Sharks are still pretty consistent, they're able to bring out some powerful cards like Totally Awesome. I just feel like the use of the gimmick of the deck isn't as good as other decks we're going to be talking about, so probably just in the middle right now, and Teemu Branded is definitely where Sharks belong.
Next up, Sky Strikers. Sky Strikers genuinely pretty cool. I'll put them up here because they're definitely a deck that can top. They're definitely a really good deck, and specifically the Power Spell version is just fantastic. The going second, Power Spells, run like 4 monsters in your deck, and then the rest of the deck filled with really powerful spells. It's so fun, it's so unique compared to every other deck, and it's just really good and really budget. Triple Tactics Trust getting a reprint recently. That's pretty much the most expensive card in the deck, but other than that, the deck is extremely cheap. All of the Sky Striker cards have been reprinted by this point. It's really fun, really strong. Sky Strikers are a fan favorite deck. They'll always see some success no matter the format. And there's a lot of different ways you can play it. A going first version is good as well. It's just awesome. It's just a really good deck, really cheap, really customizable. You can play it pretty much however you like, as a going first build, a going second build, and you will see success with it. It's genuinely a really good deck.
Yeah, I love Sky Strikers, probably one of my favorite decks. The versatility of them are fantastic. I think if you're looking back to Sky Strikers a year ago, one of the big problems was that like the Sky Striker package itself was relatively cheap enough to get. However, some of the staples were just outrageously priced. So that's why it wasn't really a budget deck about a year ago. But now, considering that Thrust was reprinted and then a lot of the Board Breakers was reprinted a lot as well, just means that you're able to play this deck to its like maximum capacity on a budget as well. I personally prefer kind of like Blind Second, like Spell Turbo, where you're just playing as few monsters as humanly possible in order to get a bunch of spells that you're able to get into the graveyard as quickly as possible so that you can get the full advantage of your Sky Striker spells. Sky Strikers are very good, but I do think that you need to really know what you're doing and really take time to get to learn the deck in order to know all the intricate details about it. So it's definitely a really powerful deck, very good to be budget right now. But I will say you do need to spend a lot of time with it in order to adapt it to its full potential.
Next up, Exodia. Exodia is definitely a good budget deck. I'm going to show my bias here and put them up to the top because everyone loves Exodia. It can play certain cards that a lot of decks can't. It can play Lava Golem, it can play Shifter, even play Sphere Mode if you want. The deck is fairly cheap. Your most expensive card would be the Heart of the Blue Eyes, but that's not even that bad. For the most part, this deck is extremely cheap and has some really good gimmicks it can use. Of course, Lava Golem and Shifter are just great cards that this deck really makes good use of. The deck's really good against like Mulcharmies and stuff like that, and really good against opposing like Dimension Shifters and stuff like that. Plays decently well into hand traps. It's a really good deck. It has seen a lot of success since it came out, and of course you're playing Exodia, it's just so fun. It's able to OTK your opponent, it's able to wipe their board with the trap, it has inherent Omni Negates. It's just a really good deck. I'm a big fan of it. I think it's awesome. And definitely a great deck for a budget player to pick up.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Sean's played this a good bit, and the amount of times I lose to this deck is crazy. It's just a really powerful deck. I kind of underestimate how much it can actually do. Considering the amount of cards that are new to it, like it completely changed the deck from what it was. It can now very consistently bring out a very powerful Exodia Fusion monster that can get up to a ridiculous amount of attack. I feel like it is a very simple deck to get to learn. So I definitely would recommend you guys pick it up as soon as possible, because you never know, it might go up in price, just considering that the printing was fairly recent, so you probably won't be getting reprints anytime soon. So I definitely would recommend you guys pick this up. It's definitely one on the higher end of spending the Christmas money.
Next up, we have Branded. I think Branded is one of the best decks on the list, even despite the limit to Branded Fusion and the ban of the Gimmick Puppet. However, it is a bit pricier than the decks above it. So for that reason, I think it belongs at the bottom of the second tier. But that doesn't mean it's a bad deck at all. It's just a tiny bit more expensive than some of the decks above it. But it's still very powerful. Even with Branded Fusion at 1, it can do a lot. It's still Branded. Branded is still really good. If Master Duel has taught us anything, Branded Fusion to 1 does not stop this deck at all. Most of the cards have been reprinted by now, either in the 2024 tins or in all of the quarter century rarity collection sets. There's even a lot of really cool cards the deck can run, like the new Light and Darkness Dragon Fusion monster, which is fantastic. It's like a Fusion Apollosa pretty much, which is awesome. The deck's just really good, and it's finally budget now, which is fantastic. So if you're willing to spend a bit more money than some of the other decks, you're looking at a really strong deck here and a really good contender in the meta.
I definitely agree. I think it's a shame that Brand had to take a hit in the ban list in order for the price of everything to go down. But still, it is a very, very powerful deck overall. Although they do have some pricey cards, like the likes of Quem and stuff like that, which is still sitting around a tenner. The main engine itself actually is relatively cheap enough, considering that like core cards were printed in a structure deck, and a lot of people will probably be selling at least 2 copies of their Branded Fusion now. It will be a lot more accessible to get this deck than ever before. Sanctifier Dragon isn't as good now that Give Me Puppet Nightmare isn't around, but there are still some very good floodgates that you can bring out with it, such as Ibly or even Dark Angel or something like that. There are so many ways to get the Branded Fusion, there's so many ways to still fuse without Branded Fusion in the deck, so I still think it is quite consistent enough as is. The likes of Branded Opening is still unlimited in TCG, and the likes of Fusion Deployment for Cartesia are all unhit, so you're able to fuse quite easily without the reliance on Branded Fusion. And also considering that Thrust was reprinted as well, you can still make a pile deck with Branded, which I think is very, very fun and cool.
And even Grass is back, so if you want to take this deck in a 60 card build, you can definitely do that as well. Next up, Yubel. Yubel, we're talking here about pretty much Unchained Yubel, not the Fiendsmith stuff. You cannot play Fiendsmith on a budget, unfortunately. But Yubel Unchained is definitely not a bad deck at all. It was fantastic a few months ago, and that hasn't changed. Yeah, some of the cards are a bit expensive, like your Nightmare Thrones and your 1 copy of Phantom. But overall, it's way more budget than it used to be. It's a fantastic deck. The most recent ban list really helped this deck out because we got our Spirit Gates back. Even though we did get Phantom to 1, that honestly just helps budget players because you only need 1 copy. All the Unchained stuff has been reprinted at this point, so that engine is pretty much pennies as well. It's just a really, really good budget deck. The same thing as Branded though, a little bit more expensive than other decks, but it's just that good that if you're willing to spend a little bit extra money, you're in for a fantastic deck.
I definitely agree. In terms of power of the deck, I think it should be a lot higher, but considering we're talking about budget more in consideration than anything else, it can still be pricey enough, but I think it deserves a spot kind of on the low end of spending the Christmas money, just because it can be quite pricey, but it also is quite powerful as well. One thing I will say about Yubel is that a lot of people are going to be playing with Fiendsmith, and Fiendsmith is just a ridiculous amount of money. So it still is a testament to its power that you can still play Yubel without it. I've been messing around with it without the Fiendsmith engine, and I've actually been having a lot of success. I do think it is a very good deck, not one to look down upon. I do think it deserves space right in the middle of spending the Christmas money.
Next up, Labrynth. Now Labrynth is a fantastic deck, but it is just a tiny bit more expensive than the decks above it. It's really good though, definitely one of the best decks. Labrynth is just always a great deck. A really good trap control deck. Although a lot of the cards have been reprinted, they're still fairly expensive unfortunately. Your Arius is pretty expensive, the Rumor Cannon is kind of annoying. Depending on how you want to build your extra deck, some cards can be pretty expensive. While Typhon's not mandatory, it's a really good card in the deck, you kind of don't want to go without it. Same with Chaos Angel, stuff like that. It is a bit more expensive, and I mean, to be honest, Sharks are just a better budget deck. It's budget compared to a lot of decks, but overall, it is not the most budget deck in the game, so yeah, it is great, but a little bit too expensive to be any higher.
Yeah, it was great to get Transaction Rollback reprinted and stuff like that, but there still are some pricey cards in the Labrynth pile, so you do kind of need to be taking the wallet out a little bit in order to get some of the more sought after cards, which can be quite annoying and it can drive the price up a little bit. So although it's not the best deck for a budget player, it is still a very good deck. If people are willing to spend the money on it, it would definitely be one of the high contenders. But consider we're taking budget into consideration here, a lot more overpower. It kind of deserves to be on the lower end of the list, just kind of like at the end of Temu Branded. So definitely a very good deck, but you will be spending a bit more money on it than you would with some of the other decks.
Next up, Pure Kashtira. Honestly, I think this goes about here. Somehow, Kashtira prices have dwindled enough to where this deck is genuinely budget. If you're playing Pure Kashtira, you can get away with running a small Kashtira engine, it won't cost you too much, and you have a very strong deck on your hands, very good kind of control deck. It can play Shifter, which is just fantastic. Of course, Fenrir and Unicorn are just insanely good cards, and somewhat affordable now. The reality is, a lot of these decks, like fully made, will cost you around $100. But of course, that's including hand traps and staples and that, and those can be fit into any deck, so once you have them, you have them. So building a new deck won't cost as much. But even still, Kashtira is really good as a control deck and as a banishing deck, that just buying 3 copies of your Fenrir and Unicorn pretty much is the bulk of the price of the deck, And once you have that, you're pretty much smooth sailing from there. Everything else is really, really cheap, and it's just a fantastic deck. So many different Exes you can put in the extra deck as well. So I think it belongs about the middle of the second tier.
But I do say that Fenrir and Unicorn are fairly pricey in terms of the cards themselves. You can get the rest of the deck for cheap enough, but just like your main actual core is still pricey, so probably move it down a slot or two. It is still a very, very powerful deck. Keep in mind, we are not talking about Fiendsmith at all. Kashtira itself is budget enough that you can still play it, but it is definitely on the pricier side, so yeah, I think it does go down a few slots. But yeah, still, it's in the second tier. It is still a very, very powerful deck. Honestly, you can definitely win a lot of games with this. It is just kind of expensive.
Next up, Goblins. I don't know what to say, but the numbers don't lie. Goblins are topping a fair amount of events somehow, mainly with the armored Exes cards. So armored Goblins are doing pretty well, and it's a very, very affordable deck. I don't know what's happening. The Goblin gamers are at it again. The Goblin grind set is here to stay. I don't understand it, but I do like the Goblin gimmick. I like kind of rank 3 spam decks. They're really cool. Rank 3 monsters are really cool. I like Exes decks in general. They always tend to be pretty budget, and it's just a really, really good deck. Has access to some really strong monsters. Of course, the rank 3 engines are really good. Cards like your Speed Road Terratop and your Tour Guide of the Underworld are just really good for spamming out rank 3s on the board alongside your Goblins. The Armored Exes package is really good as well. Very cheap and just fits in this deck really well. However, as Luke mentioned with Sharks, it is an Exes deck, so it just kind of finds itself in an awkward position with a lot of decks kind of aiming to counter Raziel, so they'll be caught in the crossfire of cards like Dimension Barrier and stuff like that. But it is genuinely seeing success, and I can't argue with the numbers. It's cheap and it's doing well, so Goblin Bikers, let's go.
Yeah, I was very surprised to see like how much this deck is topping events and stuff like that, but upon research for this video, Sean and I seen that there's a lot of like representation of this deck in tournaments and stuff like that, and they actually are doing very, very well. Honestly, I just really like this deck because I think it's really, really funny. I just wasn't expecting this to be a good deck. I kind of was just thinking it was going to be a gimmick, but I'm actually very, very impressed. And I think that the fact that it's able to rely on rank 3s and rank 3 engines such as Underworld and Terratop, like you mentioned, means that it has a bit more consistency than Sharks does, because Sharks need to bring out like rank 4s in order to go for their Exes package, whereas the Goblins can just go for rank 3s, which have a lot more consistency than rank 4s, I feel. So Goblins are definitely really, really good. They can do the Exe armor package a lot better than Sharks can. I just think it's a great deck. I think it's really, really cool to see that it can actually do well. I think it's one to look out for if you guys are a budget player and looking to find a new deck to try out.
Next up, Fire King. Fire King was hit on the ban list mainly because of Snake Eye, and if you want to play this deck to its fullest potential, maybe you need like Azamina cards and stuff like that. But if you're just talking about pure Fire King, it's about mid-tier, I think, mainly because Volcanics is fairly expensive, and you need 3 copies if you want to play pure Fire King. The structure decks are cheap enough. You can pretty much get all the cards you need from the structure decks, which is great. That really just help out budget players, and it's definitely not a bad deck, but the combination of losing the Snake Eye engine alongside the fact that Volcanics is pretty expensive, and the fact that if you want to play this deck to its fullest potential, you need to invest in some stuff like the Fiendsmith engine, I think it goes about here. It's not a bad deck, not at all, but for the reasons I just said, I think it belongs about mid-tier.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I would like to argue that it should be higher just because I do like Fire Kings. But yeah, considering that you do kind of need to invest in a few other cards in order to make it actually function to its full potential, is kind of a thorn in its side, but you do get the majority of the deck out of 3 structure decks. So if you guys want to get like 3 structure decks and give it a try, that would be a good introduction to Fire King itself. But it is missing a few cards that you do need to kind of invest in order to actually play the deck to its full potential. Of course, if we're talking about Fire King, the best way to play it is of course Fiendsmith, because every best way to play a deck is a Fiendsmith variant of it. It just seems like that is the format right now. But Fire King is still very good. I still really, really do like the deck. I do think it deserves to be on the high end of Temu branded, just because it is a genuinely fun deck to play. I would highly recommend you guys picking this up and just giving it a try. Just start with the 3 structure decks, see how you like the gameplay, see how you like the style of it, and then maybe invest into some of the more expensive cards. But yeah, it is still a very fun deck, so I would give it that advantage over some of the other decks that we talk about. But yeah, I genuinely really like Fire King. I wish it was just a bit more budget with some of the other cards, but if you guys want a good introduction, go with 3 structure decks. It's a nice way to start.
Next up, the best deck in the game, Ancient Gears. Now for ranking decks based on how good they are, Ancient Gears goes in the top tier because it's the best deck in the game. However, for some reason, Ancient Gears are cursed to have the one common card in the deck that just skyrockets in price for no reason, that being Ancient Gear Catapult. In fairness, you only need 1 copy because modern Ancient Gear builds only need 1 copy, but it is kind of like a tenner, which is kind of annoying. Let's be honest, about here, it's not better than Yubel, unfortunately, but it is my favorite deck in the game, and objectively the best deck in the game. If you miss Tempai, play Ancient Gears. Tempai is not dead, but it's not budget anymore. But Ancient Gears is, right now, the better going second deck. Especially with Statue coming out in March. We don't know how expensive that's going to be. I kind of have a bad feeling it might be a little bit pricey. But it is so important for the deck and so good that if you want to play Ancient Gears, you definitely need to get the card. But right now even, Ancient Gears are just very, very fun to play. A really good OTK deck. Very similar to Tempai, they have a continuous spell, Ancient Gear Fortress, that is basically Sanguine Summoning on crack. It's not once per turn, at 3 copies, and prevents your opponent from responding to your Ancient Gear cards or effects, and they cannot be targeted or destroyed by card effects that turn. So it's just a really, really good OTK deck. Your boss monsters are fantastic. They're Earth Machine, so if you want to mix it with Earth Machine stuff, you can. Personally, I think it's better as a pure Ancient Gear build, but you definitely can change up the build however you like. But yeah, as a budget deck, really cool, and it has seen some success with the new support, and it can only get better from here with cards like Statue coming out. So I definitely think it's a really, really good budget deck.
I definitely agree. Ancient Gears, if you guys missed Tempai, go for Ancient Gears. Definitely one of the best, if not the best, going second deck out there right now. Ancient Gears is just absolutely fantastic, the way that they're able to just bring out really big monsters and go for OTKs as quickly as possible. But be warned, you do need a PhD in dueling in order to actually play this deck. So keep that in mind if you guys are willing to pick it up.
Next up, Runick. Now, objectively, Runick is very good. Runick Stun is just a very good deck, probably the best way to play a stun deck. And you know, stun is really good. It's anti-meta. It's good because the meta decks do what they do. This just straight up counters them. It's very cheap as well. However, it is limited in certain ways, of course. With power creep in the game, the best decks just inherently become better at dealing with stun. That's just how it kind of goes. Stun cards are not really getting better, but all other decks are getting better. So it is harder to play a stun deck. And of course the problem with Runick has always been going second is just really, really hard. So it is tough. And stun decks in particular really suffer against Raziel. Raziel is just a deck that just pops a million cards. So it is really hard to kind of set up your floodgates and set up your stuff against it. It is very cheap though. If you want a cheap budget deck and if you want to play stun, which is a unique way to play the game. I meant that unironically, but it just sounds so sarcastic. It is a good option to pick up. You won't break the bank, and you will definitely win games.
Yeah, you can pick up the entire deck for about 40 euro, which is very good for a Yu-Gi-Oh deck standard. And the fact that you get the entire deck for that price is very good, but out of principle, stop playing stun. God darn, please stop playing stun. You can win a few games, but honestly, you want to be a really good stun player if there are any. Just because people pretty much catch on fairly quickly to Runick now, and especially if you're just playing it like pure Runick stun. If you're going into game 2, or if you're going into game 3, you're probably not going to be winning game 3. You do really want to win the first 2, because people will tend to catch on, know how to counter it and side deck accordingly. The best way, honestly, to play Runick right now is Runick White Forest, but White Forest is ridiculously expensive right now, so we're just talking about Runick as is. Yeah, it's fine, but definitely it's a stun deck, definitely at the bottom of Temu branded. But you know, out of principle, put it in Purrely.
Yeah.
Out of principle, guys.
Speaking of the bottom tier, we have Dark World. Now, I'm not going to argue with the fact that like a 30 euro build of Dark World topped an event. I'm as shocked as you guys are. Whoever did that is insanely based. Pretty much bought 3 structure decks and said, nah, I'd win, and just, you know, topped an event. So good stuff. Dark World's an awesome deck. Unfortunately, it hasn't really changed much since the structure deck came out. All Dark World builds have pretty much been the same since the structure deck. which kind of sucks. The latest ban list gave us back some more danger cards, so Danger Dark World's a bit better now, which is really cool. And a lot of cards got reprinted, like your Dark Corridor, which is cool as well. But overall, it's not the best. You're playing the deck the same way you played it like 2 years ago, and it's alright. It's definitely a great budget deck. Like, if you just want to buy 3 structure decks and have a chance, just pick up this deck. It will serve you well enough.
Yeah, it's good to see some of the dangers starting to come off the ban list a little bit. I say by the next ban list, we'll probably have them unlimited, same way they treated Dragon Rulers and stuff like that. It's honestly shocking that they were limited for this long. But yeah, the numbers, they're just not adding up. Like, Dark World, I do really like as a deck. I think it is really cool. But we're just not seeing as much representation as one would want. The reason we put it in here was because that one guy just got 3 structure decks and absolutely annihilated an event. Massive respect for that. That was really, really cool. But yeah, in terms of the deck, it's not getting much representation. Even when all the cards, all the like chase cards were reprinted in the tin, such as Dark Corridor and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely kind of on the lower end of this list. It is extremely budget, but maybe just not the best right now.
Next up, Marincess. Now, I've preached about Marincess in the past. I think it's a fantastic budget deck. However, power creep has not been kind to Marincess. The deck is extremely cheap, but it has not gained any new cards for a good while now. It will receive the new Trickstar Marincess card sometime in 2025, which will be pretty good for the deck. However, right now, it's very mid. It's just not as good as a lot of other decks, but it is very cheap and it can fit in a ton of non-engine. It's a fantastic deck for budget players. The whole gimmick is that you start with like 1 card and you kind of end on a big boss monster. And if your hand is a little bit better, you can end on something like maybe Totally Awesome with some hand traps backing that as well. It's a really good kind of mid-range deck. You're basically committing like 1 card to get 1 good boss monster and using the rest of your hand as non-engine or hand traps and stuff like that. But again, it really lacks the firepower that a lot of the other decks do. But I really think it makes up for that in the price. This deck is just so budget. It's so good. Honestly, for that alone, I think it does belong a tier higher, just because it is the definition of a budget deck. It might not be as good, but it is budget, so I think it does belong in the second tier.
It can do some crazy things, and I do like the easy accessibility of the deck, just because not only is it cheap enough to buy, but also it's easy enough to learn. So that's one thing that's really good about Marincess. The fact that it has the ease of accessibility is really, really important for decks, especially on the budget level. I do think it has both of those going for it. So yeah, I can definitely see the argument. It may not be as good power-wise as some of the other decks on the tier list, but still, it's a nice, fun deck. I definitely would rate it quite high as well.
Next up, Exosister. Definitely a good deck, and it is fairly budget. Maybe around like Swordsoul kind of power level. It's really good. It can run Shifter. Fairly cheap. I don't think there's any kind of crazy expensive cards. Pretty much everything's been reprinted at this point. Of course, some generic Xyz like your Typhon and your Zeus might kind of jack up the price a little bit. But overall, the main engine, really cheap. It can run Shifter. It can run some really strong Xyz. And it can run a ton of non-engine. So, just another really good kind of budget deck. But similar to a lot of Xyz decks, you're going to be in the crossfire of cards like Dimension Barrier. And funny enough, cards like Lancia are going to be a big problem for this deck, considering Malice is one of the best decks in the game right now. So the counters to the 2 best decks in the game really do counter Exosister. So that does kind of suck. But as a budget deck, I don't think it's terrible at all. It does what it does, and it does what it does well. And it's cheap to boot, so I think it belongs about where it is. Next up, the second best deck in the game, just behind your boy Ancient Gears, we have Cyber Dragons.
Cyber Dragons are a really good OTK deck, but considering that they are actually getting a bunch of support that allows them to go first, we might see a drastic change in the way Cyber Dragons will be played in the future. It kind of starts with Disablaster being a very good level 5 light machine monster that you're able to easily special summon onto the field, and then it's just very easy to go into some of your boss monsters such as your Infinity. But it's still really, really good. We are going to be seeing some more support in the likes of late May. We're going to get some new Cyber Dragon cards, so maybe it might elevate it just a little bit. But as of right now, I think the power level of the deck just isn't really there. It got power crept really, really highly by Ancient Gears. They're just a really superior going second deck right now, with the fact that they have some like really, really good cards that like stops your opponent from interrupting them. I think Ancient Gears has the edge in terms of what a going second deck should do. So Cyber Dragons are kind of like left a little bit behind right now. So they're not the greatest per se in this format, but maybe come May we might see a bit of a change. But who knows, I still think the deck is still really good. It's a lot of fun to play. I just love machine decks that are able to OTK. They're always just a lot of fun. Fusion decks in particular. So yeah, Cyber Dragons are of course very, very good, but they're definitely on the lower end of spending the Christmas money.
Next up we have Sprights. I mean, genuinely, just a fantastic deck. Sprights are just so good. On a budget and just as a deck, Spright is just insanely good. Everything's been reprinted now in the latest Battles of Legends set, so very affordable. Pure Spright is a really good way to play the deck. You can play it a bunch of different ways as well, but Pure Spright is probably the most budget way you can play it. In combination with a mini frog engine, you're just looking at a really, really strong budget deck. It can play Shifter. It's not the best deck at playing Shifter, but it can play Shifter, which is points into its favour. The deck's always been good, really good into hand traps. Might suffer against some of your Molcharmies, but regardless, it's still really, really good. For the money you're putting into the deck, I'd say this probably has the best payoff. It's just such a strong deck for the price. I think Sprites are probably the new king of budget decks.
I definitely agree. I really like the playing style of Sprites. The fact that they're able to bring together Lynx and Xyz monsters in order to bring out some really powerful end boards. I just think that they're such a fun deck to play, and the fact that you can get creative with them as well and throw in a few other engines is really a lot of fun. It's kind of like what it's all about. I really like the fact that you can throw in a Frog engine, which is relatively cheap. You can throw in a Melfi engine, which is relatively cheap, and it is cheaper to throw in an Adventure engine as well if you guys want to go down that route. I definitely think it's something I might consider in the future. I do think Sprites have a very easy to play sort of style to them. They're able to inherit some of themselves out if you control a level or a rank 2 monster, which you pretty much always do in this deck, so it's a lot of ease to just spam the board as quick as possible and get into your really powerful cards. For that reason alone, I think the deck is really good at just ending on some pretty decent end boards, and the fact that you're able to do it on such a budget I think is just really impressive. I definitely think Spright deserves a spot in the top of the list.
Next up, Flunder. I mean, I know I just said it's the king, but like, Flunder's really good. Flunder has always been just a fantastic budget deck. The cards have always been cheap. It can play Shifter. It can play stuff like Harpy's Featherstorm, which is just an insanely broken card, to be honest. And it's one of the only decks in the format that can really play it. I mean, I find it hard to say it's not like at least here. Flunder's just such a great deck. Of course, Lancia is the bane of this deck's existence. Lancia literally just kills this deck. It is the ultimate counter to Flunder, and the fact that it is going to be inside decks really does kind of hurt the deck a lot. So I mean, I guess maybe about here, but it is insanely budget. Everything is so cheap. Unfortunately, it does suffer from cards like your Purrely, and that will see play in a lot of side decks. Purrely in that way is better than Max C because it gives you a draw for normal summons, which Max C doesn't. So Flunder might kind of suffer in that regard, but again, insanely budget. You really can't complain. You could probably buy the deck for the price of 3 structure decks and have a deck that's better than any structure deck. So yeah, this is insanely good. You really can't go wrong with Flunder.
Definitely agree. Flunder is an incredible budget deck. It's just one of those budget decks that kind of like never goes away, although it does have a few counters like the Lancia and stuff like that. Flunder is just too good to overlook. It is very powerful, especially depending on the format. The fact you're able to recycle resources as well just means that this deck is always on, it's always live, so you're able to just keep going no matter what, especially in the grind game. Flunder is absolutely top tier. Definitely deserves a spot in Salamangreat value.
Next up, Melodious. Somehow Melodious is a budget deck, which is pretty awesome to see. I'm thinking about here, it has not seen as much representation recently, which is strange because the deck wasn't hit at all. The deck is still at full power, and yet it kind of just fell off. Kind of a similar situation to Voice's Voice a few months ago, even though Voice's Voice is on the rise now. Melodious is kind of falling off, but it's still as powerful as it was before. However, it is another deck that kind of suffers against Lancia. It does banish cards, and that is countered directly by Lancia, which does kind of suck. But as a very strong budget deck, this really hits the nail on the head. A lot of their monsters can't be targeted if you have a specific Melodious on the field. They have really good quick effect, so you can like quick effect banish a bunch of cards you control and your opponent controls. You can banish stuff from the graveyards. It's just a really strong deck. Only problem is, it might be a tiny bit more expensive than some of the other decks above it, and not as good just considering the format we're entering. but as a budget deck, you literally cannot go wrong. It will serve you well. It's a very strong deck, and it wasn't hitting any ban list or anything like that. Pretty high up on the tier list. Next up, Purrely. Purrely's not bad, and again, extremely budget. Everything's been reprinted, but again, it's an Xyz deck, and we all know that the counters to Xyz decks are all over the place now. But not a lot of people are running Kaijus, which is really good, because once you get your Noir on field, that thing is not going away. It's not seeing as much play as it used to. That doesn't mean it's a bad deck. It's only been hit a little bit, so it's still extremely playable, still just a great deck to play. It can be a bit difficult to play. Power creep did kind of hurt this deck a bit. It's not as strong as a lot of the top meta decks, but it's definitely not bad. It's definitely very strong in its own right, and for the price, I'd say it's on par with the price of like decks like Spright. Pretty much as cheap as that, but I don't think it's nearly as strong as it, so I think it belongs about there for now.
I definitely agree, it deserves its spot high enough on spending the Christmas money, just because it is a very powerful deck in its own right. However, I will say, as someone who's played this deck, it is very complicated. I find it to be so difficult in order to just work it as a functioning deck, and it can really be frustrating, especially when you're like one card off getting your Noir onto the field like first turn. I personally find it very frustrating in that aspect, so I think it does have like a high barrier to entry. Just a lot of people might be able to pick it up and might find it fine, but I think the majority, such as myself, do find it quite difficult. You do need to be spending hours and hours with it. Having said that, if you do have your Noir onto the field, that thing is an absolute powerhouse of a card. It'll be really hard for your opponent to out it. But having said that, it is very tough in order to get it out there in the first place. It does take a lot of build up in order to get it going. And although the cards are cheap enough to pick up, considering we still have Delicious and Sleepy still at 2 each, it kind of hurts the deck just a little bit, just kind of like a small hit to consistency a little bit. But it's still fine enough, it's still relatively unscathed other than that. It is still a cool deck, but still a tough deck to learn. So barrier to entry, bit high, but still a budget deck. Definitely deserves a spot and spend Chris's money.
Next up, Dragon Archfiend. I hate to say it, but it's not great. It's not great as a budget deck. You really need to invest a lot in either Bestials, the Horus engine, or the Centurion engine to make this deck really good. If you buy 3 structure decks, it's not really going to cut it. It's a really fun deck and I really enjoy it, but you really need at least the Bestial package to make this deck work. And unfortunately, that is pretty expensive. Lubellion and your Druisworm are still very expensive, so this deck really does struggle to be a budget deck, unfortunately. But if you want to have some fun, pick up 3 structure decks. It will do you well enough, but it does belong at the bottom of the list. It's just not that good unless you want to put a good bit of money into it.
I definitely agree, much like what I said about Fire King. If you pick up the 3 structure deck, it's definitely a nice entry point for you, so that's definitely something that you guys should consider. But in terms of the actual deck itself, you do need a bit more investment on it, and some of that investment can get very pricey, so this doesn't really work exactly as a proper budget deck.
Next up, Salamangreat. I think Salamangreat is pretty good. A bit more expensive than some of the decks on this list, but it is very good. I'm going to say about here. Again, a little bit more expensive than some decks, but not by that much, and the payoff you get is really good. The new Raging Phoenix is getting reprinted soon, so already the price has dropped. However, you are playing Salads, so you do need to run at least 2, but overall, not that bad. Probably the best fire deck in the game right now, after Snake Eye's been killed. Promethean Princess is cheap now because it's reprinted. A lot of the older Salad cards are just cheap now. Even the newer ones, you don't need that many. So overall, a really good kind of fire Cyberus combo deck. Salads have always been good, and it's cool that they can still compete. They do have good competition with Malice though. Malice is kind of better Salads in a way. It's just another Cyberus Link combo climb deck. Maybe you can see it as kind of budget Malice, which is a funny way to look at it. It is very unique though, it can do a lot of really cool things. I'm a big fan of the deck, I think it belongs about there. A little bit pricier than other decks, but very strong.
I definitely agree, these fan favorite decks, they absolutely never die. People always find new ways to experiment with it, and mostly it's always to success. The fact that people are still playing this is a testament to how powerful it was during TOS format, and it's able to still persevere even through the bans and stuff like that. But still, people are playing Salads, it's still a really good deck, and what's also good to see is that Raging Phoenix was sitting at €20 for a long while, but then since the reprint was announced to be coming soon, the price of that card just completely cut in half. You're probably going to pick some up for like €10 or something like that. So it's very handy for you guys to pick up this deck. It's relatively cheap as well, so I definitely recommend you guys give it a try.
And finally, Eldlich. It is the cheapest version of stun you can play, and that's about it. It's not bad. It's a good stun deck, and it's getting new support in a few months, which is pretty cool. I don't really know if that's going to be a great help for the deck, but it is cool. It definitely will be an improvement to the deck at least. But right now, it's definitely the definition of budget. Very, very cheap. But it's just kind of a worse version of Runick Stun, in my opinion. It can run unique things that Runick Stun can't. Zombie World, in particular, is a really cool card the deck can run. And of course, your Eldlich traps are just very, very strong and very annoying. But again, counters to Malice, such as Lancia, really hurt this deck. You really want to be able to banish your traps from the graveyard. And if you're not able to do that, the deck really just falls off. So, it's alright. Definitely budget, and definitely fun to play if you like the gimmick and the style. But for now, it belongs where it belongs.
Yeah, you know, with the new fusion that's going to be coming out, I don't really see it doing a whole lot of difference to the deck. Eldlich already had a fusion that never really went anywhere. But who knows, maybe this deck might completely change, but for the time being, I find the playstyle quite boring. Although it is cheap, I do find how you play it to be quite uninteresting. And I personally don't like it myself. So I wouldn't recommend playing it, but I can say that it is quite a strong deck. So definitely probably at the end of Temu branded. Although it is budget, it's just so boring and not fun to play. So yeah, I'd probably put it low on this list.
So that's it for the tier list. Let us know what you think in the comments. We're very eager to hear your opinion. Do you agree or disagree? Let us know. And if you have any budget deck recommendations yourself, let us know in the comments. So thanks for watching. If you want to support the channel, we have memberships. So if you want to see our videos early, you can check that out. And if you're interested in buying any of these decks, we have a TCG player affiliate link in the description, which you can check out. If you buy cards using that link, it directly supports the channel and helps us keep up the content. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more tier lists.